So, for a while now, we've been doing this series on my channel about how to create stylized avatars, how to make stylized characters and pull them into Unreal Engine and use them as VTubers or really whatever you want. So as we get into talking about style and stuff, I thought, okay, let me just record one thing where I'll just kind of break down my process for how I make characters and explain. We're going to talk today, and we're going to talk about normals, and we're going to talk about textures, and we're going to talk about draw calls, and we're going to talk about all this different stuff. And on all of it, I'm not really an expert at any of these one things. Throughout this, I'm also going to talk about where I've learned things and where you can find more information if you're super curious about any specific subheading of this little presentation. So I thought I'd start by just talking about my style philosophy. I obviously am coming to you as a little VTuber down here in the bottom of the window. I thought I'd talk a little bit about my character, how I make characters, and sort of how I think about characters. First off, the obvious question is Woody, you're a VTuber, but you're not an anime VTuber. I kind of got into VTubing through the avenue of virtual production. So I come from the world of filmmaking and stuff, and a lot of filmmakers are using Unreal Engine right now to do really cool things, including real-time animation. However, I quickly realized that okay, VTubing is really fun, and it's a really cool way to put yourself out there quickly and create stuff. I think the way I'm end up doing things now is very different than trying to create a super realistic metahuman or some sort of virtual human system that's trying to look realistic, like you'd see on a show like Love, Death, and Robots. Death, Love, and Robots. There's love, there's death, there's robots. I have what I think some members of my chat have been referring to as the Woodyverse style of creating characters. So you see I'm a pretty friendly looking guy. I'm not doing too much crazy stuff with my face. I'm here, I got my little mustache, it's a sort of a very wholesome look and not overly complicated, which is ultimately I think a pretty achievable VTuber look. My process is designed around doing things quickly and making something that we don't have to spend forever on. At any point in the process, if you break down too much in terms of VTubing, then you're unable to continue on at a pace as a solo dev. Can I make this character at a pace that won't deter me from other projects, right? Because I could spend more time making my model more complicated, or I could just kind of make a simple one that I like that is kind of winsome and fun. I want to be Woody, but I want to be digital. In this scene, we've got a VTuber that I'm making in this series. This is my wife, producer Rosie, who's going to be joining us on the show soon. I'm really proud of the way I do things, not because I always do them right, but because often I do them the wrong way. That's a big part of the way I do things is I try to get things done before I try to get things perfect. This process for me usually starts by making a base mesh. So I usually start with a base mesh model. I start with a cube maybe, I mirror it, I put on a subdivision surface. This is something I've covered before pretty extensively here on the YouTube channel. And if you want, there's an entire video you can watch where you can follow along with me as I create this character's model from scratch, just using Blender and a bunch of really helpful keyboard shortcuts. We have the base mesh and it's kind of no frills. We've modeled everything to the extent that we want. We have enough definition in the different body parts. Typically, I like to start with a reference photo. We're seeing, a T-pose of the person. I'm making a T-posed character. If I go to my first person view here, I will line up the character with the mesh. Sometimes it's confusing if your subject has a baggy shirt on or something like that. You got to do your best to figure it out. Ultimately, something that's really important is that I'm lining up my character with whoever's going to do the mocap acting. And this is huge. And I'll tell you why. Because whatever your character is, and I think Fofamed has talked about this and has a video about this, whatever character you're choosing, you're going to have problems if your real life body and your virtual body don't sync up. When you're doing mocap, let's say that you're a giant 6'4" gym bro, and you reach out to grab an object. So this here is an object in in its own space. And then what we got here is, your shoulders and head. So here's your arm here. Like this is your arm. So with your wingspan, you're able to reach out and grab the ball. Now, what would happen if you were a shorter person? If you're a shorter person and you reach out to grab the same ball, we kind of have a problem, right? Because the question arises, do we copy the same rotation of the arms to get the mocap, or do we need to sort of create a new IK solver? So let's say, you know, this person is smaller. This is the size of their arm now. Like this is the size of their arm. Now, if we just copy the rotation, you see they can't reach the ball. And if you have you know, like a new IK, that's, you know, that's fine. IK chains are inverse kinematics. It's a different way of solving for the arms. If you're unfamiliar with that, it's something that's definitely going to come up on this channel more often. Let's say that the mocap actor is smaller and they're doing this, and then, you know, but the model is bigger, then the model is doing this. It's like technically a different mocap. And we have this discrepancy between the two, because, you know, and then, like, you know, you could say, like, okay, well, what if the mocap actor was like moved closer to it? It's like that still gets weird, and you can see there's still distance on this other side. So that's sort of the problem with this, and it's the reason, like, people don't want to create a whole lot of different rigs. They would like to use a minimal amount of rigs and a minimal amount of mocap actors. So that's the problem of 3D IK. That's like sort of the problem of mocap, like why we would have a problem when our mocap actor doesn't match up with our 3D model. So we want the two to be as one-to-one as possible. So typically what I do is I like to just use what's on the model to like grab new pieces and details. So like I'll press Shift D and like now I have like an eyeball, you know, and I can make that eyeball a new object, click it, and I'll you know, I'll add like a subdivision surface modifier, and maybe I'll like extrude it out. If you look back at this here, like that's pretty much exactly what I did. You know, I just wanted a little bean-shaped eyeball, so I made a little bean-shaped eyeball. After the base mesh, I'm basically mostly just doing this. I'm just copying little pieces of the geometry, and those pieces are automatically carrying the modifiers that were on the original base mesh, which makes it really, really easy. So at some point though, looking at all this gray mess isn't really working for me, and I decide that I need to start putting on color. You can actually see in this time lapse that the character looks really, really derpy, and it's because I just haven't had enough contrast to be able to see if all my shapes are right yet. So let's talk about texturing things. One thing that I'm really big on is I just like flat style textures and colors. Like you'll notice in my work that like in my world, there's not that much going on in terms of fancy shader tricks. And I prefer it that way because it gives like a curated look. I want all of my characters to look like they live in the same world. Like this character and my character should look like they belong together. That's art direction, as we would call it in the film world. If I look into my finished model, my model has just this texture called body, right? And like, if I touch the eyes, face, hair, it's all got this body texture. And if I touch the clothes, it's got a clothes material. So like, you know, the pants, the shoes, it's all sharing the same clothes material. So the reason that is because in Unreal Engine, we have this thing called draw calls. Unreal, basically every time we introduce a new material, is going to create a new draw call. It also, I believe, is going to do that every time we introduce a new mesh too. So like, if you're not careful, you can end up with a lot of draw calls. So we want the minimal amount of meshes and the minimal amount of materials. So if I'm doing the math right, this is going to cost us 1 or 2 draw calls because we'll make a master material and then we'll make an instance of that we can use for, you know, for our 2 materials. This is done. Now, am I actually done with this character? Like, as flat as it is, and as much as I like my, you know, kind of basic colors here, I'm noticing there's not that much detail on the sweater. So, like, I could do a little bit more painting. Let's talk through the process. So, like, the draw calls are what we're keeping in mind. And if you're already familiar with the typical process of making things in Blender, then, you know, you're already familiar with UV unwrapping and with texture painting and all that. So when I made this model, I started by doing a UV unwrap. Now, this is the process of taking one's character and then If I, click A here, you can see all the different spaces. And then you can see that like these different sections of the body are mapped to different places. And we have the different colors here, and we are keeping all of these in one material. You have different objects here, and different mesh objects can totally share the same material, and you can map them to different places. And that's what you want to do because you want to keep it all inside that one texture. If you've never done UV unwrapping before, there are amazing tutorials from a lot of Blender artists out there. Like there's a lot of info out there. One good example is Blender Guru, who made like a very classic UV unwrapping tutorial. It's for an older version of Blender, but UV unwrapping in Blender really hasn't changed very much. It's a frustrating process for a lot of people. The process is pretty simple. Basically, you're going to select all the geometry that you want to select. I'm pressing the Alt key to get a little wider selection, and I'm pressing Control Plus to keep increasing my selection. And then, once I'm ready and I've got what I want, I'm going to press the U key, and then I can unwrap. Now, there's other ways to do this. You don't have to press the U key. You can go to this little UV unwrap menu up here. That's what I did. You'll notice that this trends towards making like circle shapes and stuff like that. This kind of became like a weird little cone. This is not something you would ever UV unwrap. You are typically going to want to start by just unwrapping like entire body. Basically, all that we're doing is creating a 2D map of how we want textures to be applied to a 3D entity. So once we've done that, we can get back to like a paint here. Here's my clothing base color. I could use a little bit more texture here. So like one thing that would be kind of cool is paint like a little bit of a seam here, just to give you an idea of how UVs and painting work together. When we start drawing using this system, we need to have a specific texture selected. So like currently I have this texture selected here. I want to draw on the clothing, so I'm going to grab that. If you don't have one yet, you need to make one. You go over here and you create a new texture. Now, what size texture would we want? What do we need to do here? This is 10 by 24, but do I need to change any of this stuff? Do I leave the alpha on? For the most part, don't worry about this. This is just going to set up a black background, and that's fine for most of what we're going to do when we texture paint. However, this question of resolution is a really important one. So how big do we need our textures to be? That depends on a couple things. One is your UV wrap. So how much space did you make inside the resolution of your texture? So like by default, Blender is going to give you a square UV map unwrap. So when you make this, you get to figure out how big do I want that square. Now, 1024 seems like an arbitrary number, right? Like why would we want 1024 versus like just any random number like 361 by, 233? It's sort of standard to go with these square roots. The reason that we are going to specifically choose this, at least for Unreal's sake, Unreal wants square roots of 2. I think maybe it's square roots of 64. I think 64 is the smallest one they like, because they can safely do the math to make the texture smaller when you're not there. And this is called a Mip-Map system. If you're already familiar with LODs, Mip-Maps are just like LODs, which basically means that the farther away you get the camera in Unreal from your texture, then the more you end up having trouble because you're loading a bunch of textures in the scene, and it's just too much. You have way too many textures. The Mip-Mapping system allows us to size down textures, and Unreal will do that automatically. However, it's only going to do that if we do something like this. So 1024 you can think of as kind of safely being HD as long as you're looking at the whole texture. And that's because I'm usually conserving a small amount of detail, and I'm typically streaming in 1080p HD. So let's say for example, the only texture work that's really going on that is like painted differently are the cheeks right here in this character. And then let me open up my body texture bake, and I'm also going to open up that for editing over here. Typically with these characters, I'm often making 2K textures, which are 2048 by 2048. 4096 is a 4K texture, and like an 8K texture is like 8180 84 or something like that. I don't remember actually offhand. Like whatever this is multiplied by 2, that's an 8K texture. And the 4K texture is probably about as big as you should get in Unreal for most projects, unless you're doing like close-ups of a bunch of rocks. You should mostly leave those alone. Like nothing in my world at all would have an 8K texture, because I mean, a lot of this texture stuff isn't doing that much work. Like we can store color data in a lot less space than this. For this character, I could technically, if I wanted to, I could fit everything into like a 128 by 128 texture, and it would probably look okay. But there will be times where I will still want to change something later, and I'll wish I had more resolution. So I'm gonna bring up my clothing here. I'm gonna select the clothing object. I'm going to go to the texture paint, and it already automatically will select the clothing base color, and you can see when I start drawing on this character, it appears on the character. Let me turn up the strength of my brush here. And you can see it also appearing down here on the model. Now, you can see this resolution's not great. One is because our brush is kind of jagged. Like if I make a better line here, you can see it looks a little better. You know, like that's a little bit rough. So like the thing I would do is I would probably want to do threads around the collar line, but the resolution is so bad, that's not really going to work. So what I would need to do, and I do actually like the shape of that, I think I will go back and make those threads, but I'd need to make a bigger UV space on the map, or I would need to just have a larger resolution texture. I want to have an extremely small amount of materials. However, typically I don't start by just painting these. Like I'm not going in and painting everything on the model. I start by making a bunch of little materials. Let's see. So like in this example, I do have a shader for my skin, and I have figured out all the hair and stuff, but I still have a shader for my shirt, and a shader for my pants, and a shader for the shoes and stuff like that. And I want less shaders than that. When I first started streaming this, I thought this would be a good tutorial for a bake, and then my actual baking results were horrifying because I model with multiple meshes. So what I ended up doing was grabbing my colors from the materials, from the base color texture input, and then transferring it into my paint color. Then I just drew in all the UVs by using a mask, really simple and easy. Southern Shoddy is an amazing reference for all kinds of stylized characters, but his texture painting tutorial in Blender is where I often send people, anyone who's asking about how to get started with just the basics. You can check it out in the link below. Normals is interesting. So like, do you see on my face right now, I've got like a little weird spot, like when right next to my mouth. Like I've got like when I point up, it looks a little bit dark. When I point down, it looks a little bit light. This is kind of new, and I'm not sure what's happening, but most of the time when you see a little issue like that, you realize there's like a problem with our normals. So like normals affect the way the light is interpreted on a surface. For this character, there's a lot of default normals. However, in places, that's not the case. So like this belt needed specific shading. I wanted the belt to like look flat and not look weird. So I turned on auto smooth normal, and I changed the threshold level for what that is. Basically, whenever we shade smooth, we need it to not look all gummy and weird. So if I turn that off, you can see, actually, it looks a little bit better because it looks like it's got a little bit more gradient, but you can't see that like flat line on the belt. So auto smooth helps us with the normals, with the way light gets interpreted. I like both of those, actually, weirdly. And this is also a lot of the case with a lot of anime VTubers. They're thinking about, you know, how do I make my thing look like anime or manga or something where like the light affects the face pretty flatly. So like here's a work in progress character that I've created for a film project. And in this scene, the light is pretty flatly changing our character's face. So if I introduce a new light here, bring it out front, stuff, and move this light around this character, you can see that it's pretty flat on her face. And that's entirely the look I wanted here. When I get in close to this character, and I turn on my geometry, you can see that her face is not even flat at all. It's not even close. It's like a specific face that I wanted, and yet the normals are different. So in Blender, we can do that through a couple of different methods. This is like the space where I edit normals. What I will typically do, actually, is I will flatten a character and take the default normals, and then I will apply them to the other character, using those flattened normals to make the face look more flat. This looks like a scene out of like the original Blade Runner or something like that. This freaks me out so much. So I have this data transfer modifier here, and this is actually going to let me pull in normal data from a different place. You can see I have a different source, this like body with new blend shapes. You can see I have like a lot of recurring stuff here. This is like sort of mid-experiment, so you can see there's a lot of different things that I'm trying to fix. When the light is like backlighting her and stuff, it kind of comes in at the same predictable place. As always, there's a link in the description to our Discord channel where you can chime in with others about how to create stylized characters and all of that good stuff.